Arthur Harrington didn't look at his daughter when he signed the paper. He just picked up his pen, pressed it to the contract, and moved his hand across the page like he was authorizing a shipment of coal, something heavy, inconvenient, and better dealt with far from his office. His lawyer stood to the left. A man Penelope had never seen before stood to the right, thick-armed and quiet, wearing the kind of expression that belonged to someone who had done worse things than this and slept fine afterward. Her father blotted the ink dry, set down the pen, and finally looked up, not at her face, but somewhere past her left shoulder, as though she were already gone. "It's done," he said. That was all. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be erased by the one person who is supposed to protect you, stay with this story. Follow this channel so you don't miss a single moment of what comes next, because I promise you, this woman's journey is only beginning. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night it started, Penelope Harrington was wearing a dress that cost more than most men in Denver earned in 3 months. Her mother had picked the fabric, deep emerald silk, the kind that caught candlelight and held it. But her mother had been dead 6 years, so the dress had been ordered by her father's personal secretary, a thin-lipped woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had measured Penelope twice and written the numbers down without comment, which was its own kind of cruelty. The Harrington Winter Gala was held every December in the grand ballroom of the Windsor Hotel, and it was the sort of event where a man's worth was measured by how many other men wanted to shake his hand. Arthur Harrington shook a great many hands. He moved through the ballroom like water finding its level, effortlessly, inevitably, always gravitating toward power. Penelope watched him from near the punch table, holding a glass she hadn't touched, trying to make herself small in a room full of people who are very good at making other people feel exactly that. She was 24 years old. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, wide set, the kind that picked up every small dishonesty in a room, and her father's chin, which was strong, and which she had been told, more than once, was not becoming on a woman. She was not thin. She had never been thin. She had spent years in quiet negotiation with her own body, learning when to stand straight and when to let her shawl do its work, and she had gotten very skilled at reading a room before the room had a chance to read her. She knew, for instance, that the 3 women near the fireplace had already said something about her dress. She knew because they stopped talking when she looked their way, and 2 of them smiled, which was worse than if they had kept talking. She also knew that the man her father wanted her to meet tonight was already watching her from across the room. His name was Gerald Fitch. He was 47, recently widowed, and owned controlling interest in 2 banks and a mining operation east of Colorado Springs. He was not an ugly man. He was the kind of man who had been handsome in his 30s and had since become something else, something that wore handsomeness like a coat that no longer fit quite right. He had a way of looking at women that Penelope recognized immediately, not desire exactly, more like appraisal, the way a buyer looks at livestock before deciding what it's worth. Her father appeared at her elbow so smoothly she nearly flinched. "Gerald is going to come speak with you," Arthur said. He didn't look at her. He was scanning the room with those pale gray eyes of his, already calculating 3 conversations ahead. "I'd like you to be pleasant." "I'm always pleasant. You know what I mean." She did know. He meant, don't argue. Don't say anything sharp. Don't make a joke that goes over people's heads. Don't be too much. Don't be yourself. "He's been asking about you," Arthur added, and this was meant to be a gift, proof that she had value, that someone wanted her, that her existence could be turned into something useful after all. "He's a serious man, Penelope, the kind of man who could offer you a very comfortable life. He's older than you. By 4 years, that's nothing." "It's not nothing to me." Arthur's jaw tightened. It was the smallest movement barely visible, but she had spent 24 years reading that jaw, and she knew exactly what it meant. She had pushed against something, and the thing had pushed back. "Gerald Fitch," he said very quietly, "is one of the most respected men in this territory. An alliance with his family would benefit everyone, including you." He finally looked at her then, and his eyes were not unkind exactly. They were something colder than unkind, something more deliberate. "I'm asking you to be cooperative just for one evening." He walked away before she could answer, which was also a thing he did. Gerald Fitch crossed the room to her with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never been told no by anything that mattered. He was with another man, younger, who peeled away toward the bar as Fitch arrived. And then it was just the two of them in their small circle of space, and Penelope smiled and said hello because she was very good at hello. "Miss Harrington." He took her hand and held it a beat too long. "I've been looking forward to this." "Have you?" she said. "Not a question. Your father speaks very highly of you." She almost laughed at that. "Does he?" Fitch tilted his head slightly. He wasn't used to responses that weren't quite answers. "He tells me you're well-read, that you have opinions." "Most people do." "Not most women, not the ones I've met." He said this like it was a compliment. She looked at him steadily. "That might say more about the women you've chosen to meet than about women in general." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, more like recalibration. He had come to this conversation expecting one thing and had found another, and she could see him deciding what to do with that. "You're direct," he said. "I try to be." "I like that." He smiled, and the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Within reason." The conversation that followed was 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, the kind Penelope had been doing since she was old enough to attend her father's dinners. Fitch talked about his properties, his investments, his plans for the coming decade. He asked her questions that weren't really questions. They were tests, and the correct answer to each of them was a version of agreement. She gave him almost none of those answers, and she watched his patience thinning like ice in spring, not breaking yet, but showing its weakness. Then he said the thing. He had been talking about his late wife, briefly, the way men mention inconvenient things, and he said almost casually, "Of course, I'd want a second wife who was more—" He paused, and his eyes moved over her in a way that was not subtle. "More manageable, more suited to the demands of the position." Penelope set her punch glass down on the nearest table. "Manageable," she repeated. "I only mean, I know what you mean." Her voice was perfectly even. It was the voice she used when she had made a decision, and the decision was irreversible. "Mr. Fitch, I think you should know something. My father has arranged this introduction because he believes I'm the kind of woman who can be traded for a favorable business arrangement. And maybe he's right about the trading part. I have no doubt that's what's being discussed." She watched his face go carefully still. "But I'm not manageable. I never have been. And any man who marries me expecting otherwise will have a very long and very frustrating life ahead of him." Fitch stared at her for a long moment. Then he said without any warmth at all, "You'll regret that." "Probably," she said. "But not tonight." She walked away from him. She kept her back straight and her chin level, and she did not look toward her father, even though she could feel him somewhere across the room, could feel the exact moment he registered that something had gone wrong. She made it to the edge of the ballroom before her hands started shaking. The rest of the evening collapsed fairly quickly after that. She didn't see what passed between Fitch and her father. She was in a side corridor, getting her breathing under control. But she heard about it later from Mrs. Aldridge, who had the bad luck to be near the punch table when Arthur Harrington's composure broke. He hadn't shouted, he never shouted, but his voice had dropped to something that Mrs. Aldridge described, pale-faced, as not a voice I recognized, and several people nearby had found sudden reasons to be somewhere else. The carriage ride home was silent. Arthur sat across from Penelope in the dark and looked out the window at the passing city and said nothing for 12 blocks. She had learned over the years that his silences were not empty. They were full of things he was choosing not to say yet, things he was organizing into the most efficient shape before he deployed them. She sat very still and watched the gaslights go by and waited. "You humiliated him," Arthur said, finally, still looking out the window. "He humiliated himself. In front of Caldwell and Morrison and half the board." A pause. "You made me look like a fool." "I made you look like a man whose daughter has a spine. Some people might consider that an asset." He turned from the window then and looked at her, and the look was very quiet and very final, and it was the look she would think about later, would think about for years, because it was the look of a man who had made a decision. "That's enough," he said. She didn't argue. There was nothing in his face left to argue with. 3 days passed. Penelope moved through the house carefully, the way you move through a room where something fragile has been left on the floor. She took her meals alone. She read in the library and went to bed early, and did not go downstairs when she heard her father's colleagues arriving for the closed-door meetings that ran late into the evenings. She was waiting, though she didn't let herself think the word. She was just careful, alert. A body that knew something was coming before the mind had named it. On the 4th morning, Arthur came to her room. He was dressed for the office, coat buttoned, pocket watch already in his vest. He stood in the doorway and didn't come all the way in, which was a thing she noticed, like he didn't want to be inside the space with her. "I've made arrangements," he said. "You'll be leaving Denver." She looked at him. "Leaving?" "There's a man in the San Juan Mountains, a trapper. He's agreed to take a wife." The words arrived one at a time, and her mind kept rejecting them, kept trying to fit them into some other shape that made sense. "You've sold me," she said. "Not a question this time either. I've arranged a marriage. It's different." "How?" Her voice was very flat. "Tell me how it's different." He looked past her, at the window, at the mountains visible in the far distance on a clear day. "He's a capable man. He'll provide for you. You'll have a roof and food, and you're sending me into the wilderness because I embarrassed you in front of Gerald Fitch." She stood up from the chair where she'd been sitting. "That's what this is." Arthur's jaw did the thing. "You've made it clear you're not suited to life in Denver society. This is a more appropriate—" "Don't!" The word came out harder than she intended. "Don't make it sound like a gift. Don't dress it up." She crossed the room until she was close enough to see every line of his face, every careful angle. "You're punishing me. Just say it." Something moved across his expression. Something fast. Something that might have been guilt, or might have been the memory of it. It was gone before she could be sure. "You leave on Friday," he said. "Mrs. Aldridge will help you pack." "What if I refuse?" He looked at her fully then, for the first time in days, and his eyes were as gray and flat and certain as a winter sky. "Then you'll leave without being helped." He left. She stood in the center of her room and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor and down the stairs, precise and unhurried, and she thought, he practiced that. He knew exactly what he was going to say before he came in here, and he said it, and now he's going back to his office. She sat back down. Her legs had decided that was necessary. Mrs. Aldridge came that afternoon with a valise and a list. The list was practical. Wool stockings, a good coat, basic provisions. And it was clearly prepared by someone who had thought carefully about what a woman would need in the mountains, and not at all about what a woman would feel being sent there. Penelope watched her lay items out on the bed with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a task they had not designed. "Mrs. Aldridge," Penelope said. "Did you know? Before the gala?" The older woman paused. Her hands stopped. Then she kept working, smoothing a wool skirt over the edge of the valise. "My job is to assist your father, Miss Harrington." "That's not an answer." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." She folded the skirt. "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry." It was the most honest thing anyone in the household had said to her in years, which was its own kind of indictment. Friday arrived the way bad days do, ordinary at first, gray and cold, the kind of morning where the coffee steams and the house is quiet, and for a few seconds after waking you forget what day it is. Then you remember. And then you get up, because getting up is the only thing you can do. Her father was not home when she came downstairs with her valise. She had not expected him to be. Mrs. Aldridge stood in the foyer with a leather satchel, food for the first day of travel, and pressed it into Penelope's hands without looking at her face. There was a man outside with a wagon. Not Mercer, not yet. Mercer would come later, would arrive in her story like a storm that's been building for days. This was just a hired driver, young, who didn't know what he was carrying or where it was going and who seemed grateful for that ignorance. He helped her up onto the seat and clicked at the horses, and Denver began to fall away behind her. She looked back once. The Harrington house stood square and gray and permanent against the November sky. 3 floors, 12 rooms, the big iron gate her father had installed the year he made his first million, when he'd decided that what he had was worth protecting from the outside world. She had grown up behind that gate, had learned to read behind it, learned to be quiet behind it, learned all the ways a girl with her specific combination of qualities, too smart, too stubborn, too much, could make herself acceptable, or at least invisible. She looked at it for exactly as long as it took the wagon to round the first corner. Then she faced forward. The road south toward the San Juan Mountains cut through country that changed by the hour, the outskirts of Denver giving way to open land, the open land giving way to foothills, the foothills beginning to gather themselves into something more serious and more permanent. She had never been out of the city. She had read about this country, had seen it in illustrations, but illustrations did not prepare you for the scale of it, the way it made the whole human project feel small and specific, like a footnote. They stopped twice. Once to water the horses at a creek that was beginning to ice at its edges, and once because the driver needed to check a wheel that had begun to sound wrong. Both times, Penelope climbed down and stood in the cold and breathed the air, which smelled like pine and cold stone, and something underneath those things that she didn't have a word for yet. She had one bag. In it, 3 wool dresses, 2 pairs of stockings, a spare pair of boots that were slightly too tight, her mother's hairbrush, and a novel she'd grabbed from the library shelf on her way out without stopping to look at the title. She'd checked later. It was Middlemarch. She didn't know if that was luck or something else. The temperature dropped as they climbed. By afternoon, snow was falling. Not hard, just the first polite snow of winter tasting the air. The driver pulled his coat tighter and said nothing. Penelope watched the flakes land on her sleeve and dissolve and thought about the contract her father had signed. She hadn't seen it, hadn't been shown it. She only knew what Arthur had told her, that there was a man, that the man had agreed, that this was done. She wondered what the man was like. She imagined old, rough, indifferent. She imagined the cabin would be dark and cold and smell like things she didn't want to name. She imagined she would cry the first night, probably, and that there would be no one there to hear it, which might actually be its own kind of mercy. She didn't cry, not on the wagon. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and felt the rough wool of her traveling skirt and made herself count the things she knew for certain. She was healthy. She was not stupid. She had read more books than anyone her father had ever introduced her to. She had survived 24 years of being the wrong shape for the world she'd been born into. She thought, whatever this is, I have survived worse. She was wrong about that, it turned out. Not about her ability to survive, but about what worse meant. She didn't know yet what was in the contract. She didn't know about the silver. She didn't know about the man with the wolf coat, or what he was going to ask of her, or what she was going to become in that mountain place before the winter was over. But the snow kept falling, and the wagon kept climbing, and she stayed upright on the seat with her bag between her feet, watching the world she knew get smaller behind her, and the world she didn't know get larger ahead. Night came down fast in the mountains. The driver pulled the wagon to the edge of a creek crossing and stopped. "This is as far as I go," he said. She looked at him. "This is the middle of nowhere. The Montgomery place is another mile up that track." He pointed. In the dark, the track was barely visible, just a slightly different quality of shadow between the trees. "He said he'd watch for you." "He said?" She stared at the track. "He said that to you?" "To the man who hired me." He was already climbing down to help with her bag, already doing the businesslike things that meant this conversation was over. "There's a lantern in the satchel, matches in the left pocket." She stood in the snow and watched the wagon turn around and start back down the mountain, the harness bells going fainter, and then she was alone in a way she had never been alone in her entire life. Without walls, without a door, without a single light anywhere, except the stars, which were, she had to admit, extraordinary. More stars than she had known existed, packed into the black sky overhead like something someone had spilled. She found the lantern. It took her 4 matches to light it because her hands were cold and shaking, and she told herself the shaking was from the cold. She picked up her bag. She looked at the track going up into the dark trees. She thought about everything she'd left behind and everything she was walking toward, and the distance between them, which was immeasurable. Then she started walking. The track was uneven, frozen mud, mostly, with patches of snow between the ruts and roots that crossed the path at ankle height, like something waiting to catch her. She walked slowly. The lantern threw a circle of orange light that moved with her and made the trees at the edge of it look like they were leaning in. The cold was a specific kind of cold, not the city cold she knew. Not damp and gray and smelling of coal smoke, but clean and absolute, the kind that got into your lungs and made you aware of them. She had gone maybe half a mile when she heard something in the dark ahead of her. She stopped. Not an animal sound, just too regular, too purposeful. Footsteps. Someone moving through the trees to the right of the track, parallel to her, moving at the same pace she was moving. Her heart did something complicated. "Who's there?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Wind in the high branches. The creak of wood against wood somewhere above her. Then, from the dark, "Montgomery?" One word, just the name. A voice that was not particularly loud, but had a quality to it that reminded her of the mountains themselves. Not soft, not trying to be, just there. "Then come out where I can see you," she said. A long pause. Then a shape moved out of the trees into the edge of the lantern light, and she got her first look at Caleb Montgomery. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd had expectations, and broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke less of effort than of long necessity. He had a dark beard, close trimmed, and a scar that ran from his left eyebrow down toward his cheekbone, pale against his weathered skin. He was wearing a wolf skin over a heavy coat, and he was carrying nothing except himself, which somehow looked like enough. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're Harrington's daughter," he said. "Penelope," she said, "if that matters." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but an acknowledgement of something. "It matters." He looked past her at the track behind her, then back. "Where's the wagon?" "Gone. The driver said this was as far as he went." Caleb was quiet for a moment. She couldn't read what he thought of that. He glanced down at her bag, her single, not very large bag, and then at her boots, which were city boots, thin-soled, already darkened with wet. "Those boots won't last the week," he said. "Then I'll need different ones." He looked at her again. Something was happening in his expression that she couldn't name. It wasn't pity, it wasn't contempt, it was something more complicated than either. He reached up and took the wolf coat off his own shoulders and held it out. She stared at it. "That's your coat." "I know what it is." "I'm not going to take your coat. It's below freezing and you're wet to the ankle and we've got half a mile uphill. Take the coat." Not a request, not quite an order. Something in between. A practical statement delivered with the assumption that she was practical enough to hear it. She took the coat. It was warm in a way that was almost shocking, heavy, smelling of pine and wood smoke and something underneath that was just him, she supposed, just the specific smell of a person who worked outdoors in all weather. She pulled it around her shoulders. He picked up her bag without asking, started up the track. "Thank you," she said to his back. He didn't answer, but he slowed his pace, she noticed, to match hers. She walked behind him in his coat and watched the mountain close around them both and thought, "This is the man my father gave me to. This scarred, quiet man who climbed out of the dark and gave me his coat without ceremony or expectation." She thought, "I don't know yet whether that's terrible or not." She was right not to know. It would take her longer than she expected to find out. Longer than the first week, longer than the first month, longer than the first time the cold came down hard enough to make the cabin walls groan. And when she finally understood, it would not come to her the way she expected. It would come the way most true things come, sideways, in the middle of doing something else, in a moment too ordinary to have predicted. But that was still ahead of her. Right now there was just the track, and the cold, and the man carrying her bag up the mountain like it was the most natural thing in the world, and the wolf coat warm around her shoulders, and the stars above the trees so bright they almost made a sound. She kept walking. The cabin appeared without announcement, just there, suddenly, between two stands of pine, a square of lamplight in its single front window. It was larger than she'd expected and smaller than she'd feared, solid-looking. the kind of structure that had been built to last rather than to impress. There was a woodpile to the left, neatly stacked and high, and a covered porch where snow hadn't reached the boards, and smoke coming from the chimney in a steady, functional column. Caleb opened the door and stood back to let her through first. She crossed the threshold. Inside, warmth, immediate and real. A fire in the iron stove in the corner. A table, 2 chairs. A shelf of books along the far wall. This surprised her enough that she looked at it twice. A bed in the back, divided from the main room by a curtain. A workbench with tools laid out in careful order. A dog, old and gray-muzzled, who lifted his head from near the stove and looked at her without alarm. Not dark, not cold, nothing she had imagined. "Sit down," Caleb said from behind her. "I'll get coffee." She sat. The chair was solid, handmade, the joints tight. She unwrapped the wolf coat from her shoulders and held it. He set a tin cup on the table in front of her and poured without asking how she took it. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let it warm her palms. "The arrangement," she said after a moment. "My father told you what I am?" Caleb sat down across from her. He had his own cup. He looked at her over the rim of it. "He told me you were available for marriage and that terms had been agreed." "That's all?" "That's all I needed to know to agree to the meeting." He paused. "I haven't agreed to anything else yet." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't marry strangers, even if their fathers have paid me to consider it." His voice was even, matter of fact. "You'll stay through the winter. Figure out if this is something that makes sense. Come spring, you decide." She stared at him. "My father paid you." "His lawyer did, yes." "And you took it." "I took it to have this conversation," he said. "What happens after the conversation is between you and me, not your father and me." He set down his cup. "He told me you were difficult. I'll tell you right now that doesn't mean anything to me one way or the other." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up, pressing at the window glass. "He called me difficult," she said. "Among other things." "What other things?" Caleb considered her. There was something in his eyes that was very direct. Not unkind, not soft, just present. Like someone who had learned a long time ago that looking away from hard things didn't make them easier. "He said you were an embarrassment to him," Caleb said. "That you'd failed to meet the standards expected of a woman in your position. That you were better suited to a life without society." He said this flatly, without inflection, the way you repeat words you have no opinion about. "He said the mountain would be good for you." She kept her face very still. "And what do you think?" He picked up his cup again. "I think a man who calls his daughter an embarrassment has a problem with himself that he's decided to make her problem instead." He drank. "And I think you've had a long day and probably should sleep." She looked at him across the table. At this man she didn't know, in this place she hadn't chosen, with her father's voice still somewhere in her chest, compressed into something small and hard and permanent. "I'm not weak," she said. She didn't know why she said it. It came out anyway. Caleb set his cup down with a small, final sound. "I can see that," he said. "Nobody said you were." Winter broke slowly, the way it always did in the San Juan Mountains. Not a clean end, but a gradual negotiation, a few warmer days followed by another hard freeze, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes, while the north sides held on stubbornly for weeks longer. Penelope noticed the change first in the light, which came back in a different quality, less flat and more dimensional, the shadows going blue instead of gray. She had learned to read the mountain the way she had once read a room. Not the same skill exactly, but the same instinct underneath. The habit of paying attention to what other people walked past without noticing. She was not the same woman who had arrived on that wagon track in November. She knew this not because anyone told her. Caleb was not the type to mark progress with commentary, but because she could feel it in the specific and physical way you feel a change in what your body is capable of. She could reload the carbine without looking at her hands. She could read the sky in the morning and make a reasonable prediction about the afternoon. She could split kindling for 20 minutes without stopping, which she could not have done in December without her arms giving out at 10. These were small things. They were also not small at all. She and Caleb had not spoken again about the contract or about Arthur Harrington since the night Caleb burned it. It was not avoidance exactly. It was more like they had agreed without words that the contract was settled and what remained was everything that came before and after it. But the knowledge was always there, the way a repaired bone is always there, present in the structure, part of how you moved. She had started going out with him on the trap lines in February. Not every day. Some mornings the cold was still the kind that discouraged everything except staying close to the stove, but often enough that she had learned the routes, learned the way the terrain changed under snow, and what it would look like when the snow was gone, learned which ridges were stable and which had a tendency to shift when the temperature changed. He taught her to move quietly in the woods, which was harder than it sounded, and involved unlearning every habit of walking she had built on streets and floors. She stepped wrong for weeks, made noise in exactly the wrong moments, at exactly the wrong times, and watched whatever she was trying not to scare go still and then go elsewhere. "Stop thinking about your feet," Caleb said one morning, on a ridge above the second creek. "If I don't think about them, they go wherever they want." "That's the point. They know where to go. You keep overriding them." She tried it. It felt like releasing a wheel you'd been gripping too hard. It didn't work immediately. Nothing did, immediately. But by the third day of trying, she was quieter, and she knew it by the way the mountain around her stayed ordinary instead of going alert. "Better," Caleb said. One word. She was learning the weight of his one words. The morning it changed was a Tuesday in early March. She knew it was Tuesday because she had been keeping track on a small calendar she'd started in January, partly for practicality and partly because she had noticed that without the social architecture of the city, the scheduled dinners and the weekly church obligations and the calendar of events that had structured her time since childhood, the days could begin to blur into each other in a way that felt like losing something. The calendar was a small act of self-preservation that she didn't examine too closely. She was outside splitting wood when she heard the horses. Not Caleb's horses. She knew the sound of those, the particular way they moved in the stable, the way the older one knocked against the stall door when he was bored. These were different. Multiple animals moving on the lower track, the one that came up from the Durango Road. She stopped splitting and stood with the axe in her hand and listened, and the sound resolved itself into riders. 2, maybe 3, moving at a pace that was not urgent but was not casual either. She went inside and got the carbine. Checked that it was loaded, which it was because she had learned in the first weeks that an unchambered firearm was furniture. Then she went back to the porch and waited. Caleb came around the side of the cabin from the direction of the stable. He had heard them too. He looked at the carbine in her hands and then at the track below, and his expression was the flat, careful thing it became when he was processing information he didn't like. "Go inside," he said. "No." He looked at her. This was not the first time she had said no to him. She had said it before, in smaller situations, and he had not argued past the first point, which she respected. But his jaw tightened now, and she understood it was not because he wanted her to obey him. It was because he was afraid for her, and didn't have a clean way to say so. "Stay back from the door, then," he said. She stepped back, kept the carbine. The riders emerged from the trees into the clearing in front of the cabin. 3 men, all mounted, all armed. The one in front was large, not in Caleb's way, but in a broader, heavier way, like something constructed for intimidation rather than use. He had a thick, dark mustache and the kind of eyes that were pale enough to be unsettling above the shadow of his hat brim. He stopped his horse at the edge of the clearing and looked at Caleb with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this before and expected it to go the usual way. "Montgomery," the man said. Not a question. "Who's asking?" Caleb said. "Wyatt Mercer." He said the name the way some men say their names, like it was supposed to do something, like the sound of it was itself a kind of argument. "I represent certain interests that have a prior claim to the mineral rights on this property." Caleb said nothing. He was standing in the middle of the clearing with his hands loose at his sides and his face perfectly neutral, and Penelope, watching from the porch doorway, had a sudden clear understanding of what 9 years alone on a mountain looked like in a person's body. He was not afraid. He was also not reckless. He was just waiting, calculating, reading the 3 men in front of him the way she had learned to read snow. I don't know what interest you mean, Caleb said, and there's no prior claim on this land. It's been filed and registered for 9 years. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man being patient with someone who doesn't understand how the situation works. Mr. Harrington disagrees. He has documentation suggesting a previous arrangement that supersedes your registration. Then Mr. Harrington can bring that documentation to a courthouse. He'd prefer a more direct resolution. Mercer glanced toward the porch, toward Penelope, and something in his expression shifted, something calculating and small. I wasn't told there'd be a woman here. There's a lot you weren't told, Caleb said. Mercer looked back at him. The smile was gone. We're prepared to make this simple. You vacate the property by the end of the month. You take what's yours, you leave the land, and we don't need to have any further conversations. And if I don't, Mercer tilted his head just slightly. Then the conversations get less comfortable. The two men behind him had not spoken. One of them had his hand resting on the stock of the rifle across his saddle, not gripping it, just resting, the way you set a tool down somewhere visible to make a point about the tool. The other was watching Penelope. She looked back at him without blinking because she had learned that not blinking was something, even when nothing else was. You've said what you came to say, Caleb said. Now you can go. Mercer held for a moment. He was deciding something. She could see it in the way his horse shifted under him, responding to something in his body. Then he clicked his tongue and turned the horse. End of the month, he said, without looking back. They rode down the track and back into the trees. Penelope listened to the hoofbeats until they were gone. Then she let herself breathe. Caleb turned around. He looked at the carbine in her hands, then at her face. I told you to stay back from the door, he said. I did stay back. I was behind the frame. She lowered the carbine. Her hands, she noticed, were steady. She found this interesting. Who is he? Mercer. He came up the porch steps. He works for whoever's paying him. I've heard the name. He's done this before in other counties. He's the man your father sends when papers don't work. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the night Caleb burned the contract, since he told her about the survey markers, since she had read the careful language of her father's intentions and understood them. She had known it and prepared for it as much as you can prepare for a thing. But knowing it was coming and having it arrive on horses in your own clearing were two different things. He'll be back, she said. Yes. Before the end of the month. Caleb looked out at the tree line. Within the week, probably. He turned back. They came to look today, to count what was here. And what did they count? 2 people, 1 structure, 1 woman who pointed a carbine at them without shaking. He said this without any particular emphasis, but she heard it. They'll report that to Mercer, and Mercer will decide what that changes. What does it change? He looked at her directly. Nothing about the plan, something about the timing. They spent the next 3 days in a different kind of preparation. Caleb showed her things about the property she hadn't been shown before. Or rather, she had been shown them, but not told what she was looking at. The ridge above the northern pasture, where the ground fell away on 3 sides, and you could see anyone coming from a 1/4 mile in 2 directions. The boulder field halfway up the slope east of the cabin, where the terrain was such that anyone moving through it had to commit to a single path. The place where the second creek ran under a shelf of rock and came out the other side in a way that could be used if someone needed to move without being seen. He also showed her the weakness in the ridge. It was a formation she had noticed weeks ago, a section of the upper face where the stone had fractured at some point, ancient damage that had healed badly, leaving a line of instability she could see in the pattern of how ice and snow behaved there differently than on the surrounding rock. She had asked about it once. He had said, geological fault, essentially, and moved on. Now he stood beside her on the ridge and looked at it and said, that formation would come down with the right force applied to the right point. She looked at him. How much force? A single shot, if it hit the right place. He pointed to a specific section, lower than she would have guessed, close to the base where the fractured stone met solid ground. The whole upper section is balanced on a fault that runs lateral. Hit the base joint and the weight above does the rest. She stared at the formation, then at him. You've thought about this before. I've thought about everything up here, He looked at her. "The question is whether you could make that shot." It was 400 yards, uphill. She had been shooting for 4 months. She was good, but she was not 400 yards uphill good. Not with certainty, not under pressure. "I don't know," she said. It was the right answer. He nodded. "Then we practice," he said. They practiced for 2 days on a target pinned at increasing distances, working up to the range, working on the breath control and the angle compensation that made long shots possible. She hit the target at 400 yards on the second day, twice out of 8 attempts, which was not reliable, but it was real. It existed. It had happened. On the third day after Mercer's visit, the snow that had been threatening since morning finally came down in the afternoon, and Caleb said they would stay close to the cabin, and she agreed, and they were inside when Rex started growling. Rex had not growled at anything in months. His old dog days were quieter than that, quieter than the animal he'd been 6 years ago when Caleb found him. So when the low sound came from his throat, both of them went still and looked at him, and then looked at each other, and then Caleb moved to the window without crossing in front of it. 3 riders, he said quietly. Same ones, plus another. 4 men. She crossed to the workbench and picked up the carbine and checked it, hands moving through the familiar sequence without needing to think. She heard Caleb moving behind her, heard the deliberate sounds of his own preparation, and then there was a knock at the door that was not the knock of someone who expected to wait. "Montgomery," Mercer's voice, flat and certain. "Come out, or we come in. Either works for us." Caleb said to her under his breath, "Window, north side. You watch the 2 on the right. Don't fire unless I tell you, or unless I'm down." She nodded. He opened the door. She moved to the north window and looked through the gap between the shutter and the frame. Mercer was on horseback at the edge of the porch, which meant he had ridden right up to the cabin, no distance between them at all. The 2 men she recognized from before were to his right, dismounted now, which was worse than mounted because it meant they were planning to use their feet. The 4th man, the new one, was still at the tree line, hanging back, watching the cabin rather than Caleb. Watching for her, she realized. He was the one assigned to watch for her. "Month's not up," Caleb said from the doorway. "Plans changed," Mercer said. "Mr. Harrington is a busy man. He'd like this resolved. I gave you my resolution 3 days ago, and I gave you mine." Mercer shifted in the saddle. He was not comfortable. She could see it, the slight tension in the way he held himself, the horse reading it and shifting underneath him. He had expected something different here, some version of a man alone on a mountain who would look at 4 armed men and do the math and decide the math didn't work. "You've got a woman to think about now," he added. "She thinks for herself," Caleb said. Mercer's eyes moved to the window. She was in shadow behind the shutter, and he couldn't see her, but he could see the gap, and she saw him see it. "Bring her out. This doesn't need to involve her." "She's already involved," Caleb said. "Your employer involved her. Back in November." Something crossed Mercer's face, a flicker of something that was not quite surprise, more like recognition, the way someone's face changes when they realize more is known than they thought. He had known. She understood. He'd been told about the contract. He had been a part of this from before he showed up at the cabin. "Get off my property," Caleb said. The 2 men on the right looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at Caleb. There was a long moment, one of those moments that feels like stillness, but is actually everything happening at once inside all the people involved. And then Mercer said something very quiet to the man on his left, and the man's hand moved toward his rifle, and everything stopped being still. The shot came from inside the cabin. Penelope had been watching the 4th man at the tree line, watching the way his horse moved, watching for the thing Caleb had taught her to watch for, the gathering of intention in a person's body before they acted. And she saw it happen, saw it with the particular clarity that comes when months of attention converge on a single moment. And she fired through the window frame at the ground, 6 feet in front of his horse. The horse reared. The man fought it. The other horses reacted to the horse, all of them spooking simultaneously. Mercer's animal spinning sideways, the 2 dismounted men scrambling back from the noise, and the confusion of suddenly unreliable horseflesh. Caleb stepped off the porch in that gap, stepped directly into the disorder, and had the rifle of the nearest dismounted man before the man had recovered enough to hold on to it. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. At the end of it, Mercer had control of his horse again and was looking down at Caleb holding two rifles, and the fourth man was still 30 yards away wrestling with an animal that had decided the situation was unacceptable. "Leave," Caleb said, "and tell Arthur Harrington that the next men he sends here will not leave on their own horses." Mercer looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at the window. He could see her now. She had moved into the light because hiding behind the shutter seemed less useful than being visible, and she was standing in the window with the carbine and she was looking directly at him. He turned his horse. The others followed. The fourth man managed his horse and rode after them without looking back, and the sound of 4 horses went down the track and diminished, and then was gone. Caleb stayed outside until they were completely out of hearing. She watched him from the window, watched the tension in his back and shoulders, the way he held the 2 rifles, the way he stood. Then he turned and came inside. He set the rifles on the workbench, stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he said, without turning around, "I told you to wait for my signal." "The man at the tree line was going to flank you," she said. "I didn't have time to wait for a signal." He was quiet. She waited. "That was a good shot," he said finally. "Into the dirt at 6 feet without hitting the horse. I was aiming for 3 feet. The altitude correction is still—" She stopped. "I'll keep practicing." He turned around. He looked at her. That look she had learned over months, the one that went straight through the surface to whatever was underneath it. And she looked back, and she could see him in that moment as clearly as she had ever seen anyone, a man who had been alone a long time with things he had not let himself want, and who was now in a cabin with a woman who had just fired a warning shot through his window frame to protect him, and who did not quite know what to do with that. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." She checked. Her hands were steady. "Are you?" "Yes." He looked at the rifles on the bench. "They'll go to Durango, report to whoever Harrington has there, and then something else will come." She had known that too. She had been knowing it for weeks. Something worse. "Probably." He looked at her. "Penelope, I need to tell you something." She had not heard him use her name very often. He mostly didn't address her directly, just spoke to the space they shared and assumed she was following. The name now had a weight to it that made her pay a specific kind of attention. "What?" she said. "I found something last month, in the snow, east of the boulder field." He went to the workbench and opened the bottom drawer, saw the medical kit drawer, the one she knew, and from beneath it, he removed a flat leather case. "A courier dropped it. I don't know if he dropped it on purpose or by accident. I've been deciding what to do with it." He set the case on the table and opened it. Inside were papers. Not many, 4, 5, but the top one she could read from where she stood, and her eyes found the familiar letterhead immediately. The Harrington Company. Denver, Colorado Territory. She crossed to the table, picked up the top paper and read it. It was a letter, written in her father's personal hand, not his secretary's, not his lawyer's, she knew the difference, addressed to someone named R. Colfax in the Denver Land Office. It described the San Juan property in terms of its mineral value. It described the arrangement made with 1C Montgomery regarding the placement of a dependent female. And it described, in the clean and careful language of a man who had learned to say things without technically saying them, the preferred outcome of that placement, and what would need to be done if the placement failed to resolve itself naturally. Naturally. There it was again. She set the letter down, picked up the second one. This was from Colfax back to her father, confirming receipt of certain funds and confirming that the land registration would be reviewed with an eye toward prior claims once the property was, as Colfax wrote, available for reassessment. They had bought the land office too. She read all 5 papers. Caleb stood across the table and watched her read them and didn't say anything. Rex had come to stand beside her, his old head at her knee, and she rested her hand on him without looking down, the familiar warm weight of him an anchor. When she finished, she set the last paper down on the pile and stood with her hands flat on the table. "This is enough," she said. "Enough for what?" "To take to a judge, a real one." She looked up at him, not in Durango. Mercer has contacts there. But in Denver, at the federal level, a territorial judge with no reason to be in my father's pocket. She looked at the papers again. This is his handwriting. This is the land office official, by name, confirming receipt of a bribe. This is... She stopped, let out a long breath. This is his empire, right here. If someone reads these who isn't bought. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Getting to Denver means leaving the mountain. I know. Mercer will have people watching the roads. I know. She looked at him. Do you know another way down? He held for a moment. Then, there's a southern route, longer. It comes out closer to Alamosa. The train from there gets to Denver in a day. When can we leave? He looked at her across the papers, across the table, across the 3 months that had passed since a wagon dropped her at the bottom of a dark track and drove away. You're sure, he said. She picked up the papers and squared them carefully and held them. My father sent me up here to disappear, she said. He signed a paper that said I was a problem to be solved. He bought a government official to make sure that when we were dead, the land transferred cleanly. Her voice was even. She was not performing evenness. She was simply past the place where the words made her hands shake. I'm not going to disappear. I'm going to Denver, and I'm going to make him answer for every single word in these letters. Rex pressed his head harder against her knee. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, one small, certain movement, the way he agreed to things that had been decided. We leave before dawn, he said. Dress for 3 days out. She was already thinking about the route, about the documents, about what a woman who had arrived on this mountain with one bag and wrong boots had become in the space of a winter, and what she was going to do with that when she got back to the city that had tried to throw her away. She was not afraid. She had spent 24 years afraid. Afraid of rooms, afraid of mirrors, afraid of her father's silence and the world's opinion and the particular cruelty of people who reduce other people to their surfaces. She had used up her fear. It was gone, burned through like the contract in the stove, and what was left in its place was something cleaner and more durable. She put the papers inside her coat, close to her body. She went to pack. They left before the sky had any color in it. Penelope had packed the night before. The documents inside an oilskin wrap, pressed flat against her ribs under her heaviest wool layer, the carbine cleaned and loaded, 2 days of food distributed between her pack and Caleb's in case they got separated, which she had started thinking about as a real possibility rather than an abstract one. She had not slept much. She had lain on the cot and listened to the mountain in the dark and run through the route Caleb had described, south through the high timber, down the back of the ridge, crossing the frozen creek at the narrow point, then following the canyon floor to the old trapper road that eventually met the Alamosa track. 3 days if the weather held. 4 if it didn't. Caleb was up before she was. She heard him in the stable, heard the horses being saddled and the quiet talk he made to them. Not words exactly, just sound. The kind of sound that said, I know it's early, I know it's cold, we're doing this anyway. She pulled on her boots, the mountain boots now, not the city ones she'd arrived in, which had long since been retired to a shelf where they sat like a record of a previous person, and stood up and went to the stove and ate the last of the previous night's cornbread standing up because there was no time for sitting. Rex was watching her from his spot near the stove. She crouched down and put both hands on either side of his gray muzzle and looked at him directly. He looked back with those amber eyes that always seemed to know more than was fair for a dog to know. Clem from the Vasquez place will come by, Caleb had said last night, when she'd asked about the dog. He checks on Rex when I'm gone more than 2 days. He knows what to do. She trusted that. She trusted Caleb's network of practical arrangements, the quiet web of reliable people he had maintained out here away from everything, each one known personally and kept by specific and earned loyalty rather than money or obligation. In 4 months she had met 3 of them, Clem, who was 60 and laconic, and had once helped Caleb rebuild the stable roof in a single day without being asked. A woman named Ada, who ran the trading post at the base of the mountain and who had looked at Penelope the first time Caleb brought her in for supplies, with the frank assessment of someone who had seen a lot of situations and could categorize them quickly, and a young man named Dario, whose exact function in Caleb's life she had never quite determined, but who appeared periodically with information and occasionally with items that were not available at Ada's. It was Ada she was thinking about as they rode out in the dark, the horses moving carefully on the frozen track, their breath and the horse's breath making small clouds in the black air. Ada had said something to her on their second visit, while Caleb was in the back of the store and Penelope was standing at the counter waiting. Ada had looked at her for a moment without preamble and said, "You're not what he described." Penelope had looked at her. What did he describe? A city woman in wrong boots who might not last the first month. Ada had gone back to her ledger. "I said he was probably wrong." "You don't know me." "No, but I know him, and he doesn't take on problems he can't solve." She turned a page. "He's never brought anyone in here before, in 9 years." Penelope had not known what to do with that at the time. Riding south now in the pre-dawn dark, she found she knew exactly what to do with it. She filed it in the part of herself that was building a new accounting of the world. What was real, what had value, what a person could rely on when the architecture they'd been handed turned out to be a facade over nothing. They rode for 2 hours before speaking. The terrain required attention. The back route was not maintained, barely a track in places. And in the dark and cold, they had to trust the horses' feet more than their own eyes. Penelope had gotten comfortable on horseback over the winter. Not graceful, but functional, the way she had gotten functional at most things up here. Through repetition and stubbornness and the specific motivation of not wanting to prove her father right about the mountain defeating her. When the sky began to lighten, pale gray in the east, Caleb pulled up at the crest of a low ridge, and she came up beside him, and they both looked back north. The cabin was invisible from here, trees between them and it, but she knew the direction. She had not let herself think of it as home. The word had too much history in it, too much of the wrong meaning, but she thought of it now and felt the specific and confusing thing you feel about a place that changed you, even if you didn't choose it. "You all right?" Caleb said. "Yes." She looked away from the north. "How far to the creek crossing?" "Another hour, maybe less." He studied the sky. "Weather's going to be fine today. Tomorrow I'm not sure about." "Then we move fast today." They moved fast. The creek crossing was the technical crux of the route. The creek was not wide, but it was fast-moving in the center, still partly iced at the edges with the ice rotten now in early March, the kind that looked solid and wasn't. Caleb crossed first, taking it on a diagonal upstream, reading the current, and she watched exactly how his horse moved and then followed the same line. Her horse slipped once on a submerged stone, and she felt it, and sat deeper, and the horse recovered, and then they were across, and the water was behind them. "Good," Caleb said. The same single word he used for the rifle shot. She had learned by now that it meant more than the word itself contained. They stopped at midday in the shelter of a rock outcrop, ate quickly, rested the horses. Penelope took the oilskin wrap from inside her coat and checked the documents. Dry, intact, the paper still crisp, and the ink still clear. She refolded them and put them back. "In Denver," she said. "Do you know anyone? Anyone we can trust before we go to a judge?" He was quiet for a moment, eating. "There's a man named Haskell, Thomas Haskell. He runs a law practice on Larimer Street, takes territorial cases. I used him to register the land claim 9 years ago." He chewed. "He's honest. That's a specific kind of rarity in Denver. Has he handled anything against my father?" "Not that I know of, but your father isn't the only railroad man in the territory who's stepped on people, and Haskell has gone up against the type before." He looked at her. "The question is whether we can get to him before your father knows we're in the city." She had been thinking about this. "My father has people watching the main train station. If he's expecting any trouble from the mountain, and after Mercer's second visit, he will be expecting something. He'll have eyes on the arrivals." She folded the oilskin back under her coat. "We arrive separately. You go to Haskell directly from the station. I go somewhere else first." "Where?" "Mrs. Aldridge." She had thought about this in the dark last night, lying on the cot. She knew. She apologized. That means she has a conscience, which means she's been living with this for months, which means she might be willing to do something about it now that there's something to do. Caleb considered this. "You're trusting a woman who helped your father pack you off to the mountains." "I'm trusting a woman who said she was sorry and meant it." She looked at him. "Those are different people." He held for a moment, then, "All right, We contact Haskell. We get to Mrs. Aldridge. And we move before your father can organize a response. He stood and started checking the horse's tack. We need to be careful about one thing. Mercer. He'll have come back through Durango, reported to whoever Harrington has there. They'll send word to Denver. He checked the cinch on her saddle, tightened it a half-inch. Your father will know something went wrong on the mountain before we get there. Then he'll be nervous. Nervous men do unpredictable things. Yes, she said. That's what I'm counting on. They reached the Alamosa track by nightfall of the first day and made camp in the ruins of an old line shack. 3 walls and most of a roof, enough to keep the wind off, not enough to be comfortable. She slept better than she expected, which she noted with the same interest she had noted her steady hands after Mercer's second visit. Something in her had recalibrated over the winter, some thermostat of anxiety that had run hot her entire life, and it was running different now. Not cold, just steadier, like a fire that had found its proper draft and was burning clean instead of throwing smoke. Caleb took first watch out of habit, and she did not argue about it. She lay on her bedroll and looked at the 3-walled ceiling and listened to him moving outside, occasional footsteps on frozen ground, and she thought about the city ahead. Denver. She had been born there, had learned to walk in its streets and breathe its particular air and navigate its invisible hierarchies with the specific expertise of someone who had no choice but to become expert. Coming back now felt strange in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Not frightening, but disorienting, like returning to a language you once spoke fluently and finding that you now thought in a different one. In the morning, she took the second watch while Caleb slept 2 hours before dawn, and she sat in the cold outside the line shack with the carbine across her knees and listened to the land around her. She had learned to do this over the winter, to just listen, without filling the silence with her own noise. The mountain had taught her that. Specifically, it had taught her that she'd spent most of her life making interior noise to drown out the exterior world, and that if you stopped doing that, what came in was information. What came in now was the sound of wind in dry grass, and the distant sound of a night bird and nothing else. No riders. No threat. Just the wide, indifferent land being itself in the dark. She was ready when Caleb woke. The train out of Alamosa left at 7 in the morning. They arrived at the small station with an hour to spare, which Penelope used to wash her face at the pump outside and attempt to make herself look like something other than a woman who had spent 2 days riding through the San Juan backcountry, which was what she was. The result was imperfect. Her coat was trail-stained and her boots were mountain boots and her hair was whatever happened to hair when you put it up in the dark without a mirror. She looked like herself, which was not a person Denver society would immediately recognize as Penelope Ann Harrington, daughter of the railroad king. That, she decided, was not entirely a disadvantage. The station was small and sparse, a wooden platform, a ticket window, a waiting bench occupied by an elderly man asleep under his hat. The station master was a young man with a nervous quality about him, the kind that came from working a job where everything ran on schedule and you were personally responsible when it didn't. He sold them their tickets without looking up and told them the train was on time and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Penelope sat on the platform bench and watched the track disappear south into the distance and thought about what was waiting at the other end of it. She had not seen her father since November, had not spoken to him, had received no letters. She had not expected letters, which told her something about how thoroughly he'd intended her to be gone. She tried to construct his current state of mind and found it easier than it would have been 4 months ago. Nervous, she had told Caleb. Nervous was right. Arthur Harrington was a man who controlled his environment with precision, and Mercer's reports would have told him that something on the mountain had not gone according to the plan, and imprecision in his plans was the thing that disturbed him most. More than guilt. More than conscience. The imprecision. That was, she thought, the fundamental thing about him. Not that he was evil. She had thought about this over the winter, had turned it over in the long evenings by the fire, had tried to understand it rather than just feel it. He was not evil in the simple way. He was a man who had decided at some point long before she was born that the world was organized into things that served his purposes and things that didn't, and that the second category was simply irrelevant. He hadn't looked past her shoulder because he hated her. He'd looked past her shoulder because she had stopped being legible to him as anything except a problem, and problems, in Arthur Harrington's accounting, didn't require eye contact. She had spent 24 years trying to become legible to him, trying to be the right shape, the right kind of daughter, the right advertisement for his success. She was done trying. She was going to be legible to him in a different way now, in the way that federal documents and a territorial judge and 11 years of Mrs. Aldridge's careful records would make her legible, and it would not require his approval or his eye contact at all. The train arrived with its particular noise and disruption, and they boarded and separated as planned, different cars, no acknowledgement of each other on the platform. She found a window seat in the third car and settled in with her pack on her lap and watched Alamosa fall away behind the train. On the train, she sat by the window and watched Colorado go past, the wide, flat reach of the San Luis Valley giving way to the gradual building of the Front Range, the sky enormous and specific above it all, the kind of sky you did not get in the city where buildings interrupted it and coal smoke softened its edges. She had not known, before the mountain, how much sky there was. She had lived in it for 4 months, and she was still not entirely accustomed to the scale of it. A woman sat down beside her around noon, middle-aged, well-dressed in the Denver fashion, with the careful self-presentation of someone who put effort into being seen as someone who put no effort in. She glanced at Penelope once, taking in the trail coat and the mountain boots, and Penelope watched her process this and file it in a category: rough woman, frontier type, not worth engaging, and then look away to the window. 6 months ago, that glance would have done something to her, would have found the familiar tender place and pressed. She sat with it now and felt nothing except a mild and distant interest in the fact that she felt nothing, and then she looked back out her own window and watched the mountains go by. They pulled into Denver in the late afternoon, the city coming up out of the plains like something that had decided to be there through sheer insistence. She had grown up here, had learned to walk these streets, had learned their rhythms and their hierarchies and all the invisible rules that governed who belonged where. Looking at it now from the train window, she felt like someone reading a book they'd read before in a different language. Same story, but she understood more of it now. The parts she'd been too young or too inside of to read clearly before were plain to her now. The city was not what it had told her it was. It was what it actually was, which was a place where power arranged itself and called the arrangement civilization. She stepped off the train into the station crowd and kept her head level and moved through it with the mountain habit of reading a space before committing to movement. Nobody looked at her twice. She was no one they recognized, and that was fine. She and Caleb parted at the station without discussion. He went left toward Larimer Street. She went right toward the residential district where the Harrington household maintained its square gray permanence behind its iron gate. She did not go to the house. She went to the small tea room 2 blocks away where Mrs. Aldridge had her lunch every Thursday. She knew this because she had observed it for years, had sometimes sat in that tea room herself on the same day, and found a quiet companionship in the parallel solitude of it. It was Thursday. She went in and sat at the corner table and ordered tea. She did not drink, and waited. Mrs. Aldridge came in at 12:30 precisely. She was a creature of exact habit, which was part of what made her useful to Arthur Harrington, and part of what made Penelope certain she would be here. She came through the door with her usual brisk efficiency, and then she stopped because Penelope was sitting at the corner table in mountain boots and a trail-stained coat, and the stop lasted exactly 1 second before Mrs. Aldridge's composure reassembled itself, and she walked directly to the table and sat down opposite her, as if this were a scheduled appointment. "Miss Harrington," she said. Her voice was very level. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, were not quite steady. "Mrs. Aldridge." Penelope looked at her directly. "How long have you known it wasn't a marriage contract?" The older woman closed her eyes for a moment. A long moment. When she opened them, something that had been held together very carefully for a long time had come slightly undone at the edges. "From the beginning," she said. "I read everything that passes through that office. I've read everything for 11 years. And you said nothing." "I said I was sorry." There was something in her voice now that had been compressed for too long, not quite grief, but the thing adjacent to it, the thing that lives in people who have watched wrong things happen and done nothing and have to go on living with the knowledge of that. "I know that's not enough. I knew it when I said it." Penelope looked at her for a moment. She had thought on the mountain about what she would feel in this conversation, whether she would be angry whether she would want to make this woman account for every month of silence. She found, sitting here now, that she mostly wanted to know what Mrs. Aldridge knew and whether she would be willing to say it under oath. "I have letters," Penelope said, "in my father's handwriting. Proof of the scheme for the land, proof of the bribe to the land office, proof of the intention behind the arrangement." She held the older woman's gaze. "What I don't have is a witness who was inside the house, who heard the conversations, who saw the documents in process before they were finalized and sent." Mrs. Aldridge sat very still. The tea room moved around them. A waitress crossing the floor, two women at the next table talking about something domestic and distant. And Mrs. Aldridge sat still at the center of it, like a person deciding something irrevocable. "I have kept records," she said finally. The words came out slowly, like something being carefully removed from a sealed place. Dates, names, amounts, conversations I witnessed. Instructions I was given to carry out and did not question at the time, and questioned later alone, in my rooms. She pressed her lips together briefly. "I kept them because I am a woman who spent 11 years watching a man do unconscionable things from behind the protection of his wealth and his reputation, and I needed there to be something written down somewhere, even if no one ever read it." Penelope stared at her. The tea room noise seemed to recede. "Where are these records?" she said. "In my rooms. I have lodgings on Champa Street. I have never kept anything important in the house. Your father's house is your father's, in every room of it." She looked at Penelope with an expression that was complicated and exhausted, and something else, something that might have been relief, the specific relief of a long-carried thing being set down. "I was waiting. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right circumstance. I had nearly stopped believing it would arrive." Penelope looked at this woman, this precise, contained, careful woman who had measured Penelope's dress and packed her bag and said, "I'm sorry," and meant it. And she felt something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite anger, but was large enough to contain both. "Will you testify?" she said, "in front of a federal territorial judge." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a long, considering moment, the kind of moment where a person is not deciding what they think, but whether they are willing to act on what they think, which is a harder and different thing entirely. Then she straightened in her chair, a small movement, barely perceptible, just a realignment of her spine, as if something in her center had shifted from uncertain to decided. "Yes," she said, "I will." They went to Champa Street first. Mrs. Aldridge's rooms were on the second floor of a narrow brownstone. 2 rooms, both spare, both extremely organized in the way of someone who has learned to make order the thing they could always control when they could control nothing else. From a locked strongbox beneath the bed, she removed a cloth-bound journal and 2 folded letters and a small ledger. She handed all of it to Penelope without ceremony, the way you hand over something you've been holding for too long. Penelope looked at the journal, at the precise small handwriting covering each page, date by date, entry by entry. 11 years of watching compressed into these pages. She did not read it there. There was no time, but she held it and felt its weight and thought, "This woman is braver than I gave her credit for." Maintaining this record in secret for 11 years required a specific kind of courage that was different from the kind you needed to fire a rifle. It was quieter and more sustained and, in some ways, harder. "Thank you," Penelope said. Mrs. Aldridge put on her coat. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when it's done." Thomas Haskell's office on Larimer Street was above a bootmaker's shop, reached by an exterior staircase that had seen better decades, the wood soft in places underfoot, and the railing a suggestion rather than a support. Caleb was already there when Penelope arrived with Mrs. Aldridge, both of them having come directly from Champa Street, moving through the city with the particular urgency of people who are on the right side of something and know that the right side has a time limit. Haskell was a man of about 50 with the build of someone who had once been athletic and had replaced that with stillness. The kind of stillness that meant he listened better than he talked, which was exactly the quality she needed right now in a lawyer. He had Caleb's account already when they came in, had been listening to it and making notes in a handwriting that was small and precise and would be, she suspected, equally precise under pressure. He stood when she entered, which she noted, and looked at the documents she was already pulling from inside her coat before she had finished crossing the room. She put the oilskin wrap on his desk and opened it. She put Mrs. Aldridge's journal and ledger beside it. She sat down and looked at him. "Tell me what you need," she said. He read everything. He read it twice, and partway through the third letter he stopped and looked up at Mrs. Aldridge, who was sitting with correct posture in the spare chair across the room. "You maintained this record contemporaneously?" he said. "You wrote these entries at or near the time the events occurred?" "Within 24 hours of each event recorded," Mrs. Aldridge said. "I dated each entry on the day it was written, not the day I remembered it." Haskell looked back at the journal. Something in his stillness had become more focused. She watched him read the way she had learned to watch things on the mountain, with full attention, looking for what the thing was telling her rather than what she expected it to say. When he finished, he set the last paper down and laced his fingers together on the desk and looked at Penelope. "These letters, taken together with the witness journal and Mrs. Aldridge's ledger of financial transactions she observed passing through the Harrington office," he said, choosing his words with the precision of someone who meant them all, "constitute what I consider a substantial and prosecutable case. Specifically, criminal conspiracy, land fraud through falsification of prior claim, bribery of a territorial land office official, and—" He paused. Not for effect, she thought, for accuracy. The disposition agreement, under its actual language, is something a federal prosecutor would likely argue constitutes conspiracy to commit homicide. The language about preferred outcomes of the placement is explicit enough, particularly in conjunction with Mrs. Aldridge's records of the conversations that preceded it. The room was quiet for a moment. Caleb was sitting to her left, and she could feel him being still in the way he was still when something required all his attention. "He'll have a better lawyer than you," she said to Haskell. "He'll have a more expensive lawyer," Haskell corrected. "That's not always the same thing." He looked at her. "He'll also attempt to discredit Mrs. Aldridge, and he'll argue the letters are subject to interpretation, and he'll have a preferred judge he'll try to route this through. What he won't be able to control is the filing itself, once it's in front of the right person." He picked up a pen. "I know Judge Elias Crum. Federal appointment, 1874, no territorial political debt of any kind. He prosecuted a land fraud case in New Mexico 2 years ago against a man with considerably more resources than your father and won it cleanly." He set the pen down. "Once this is filed in front of Crum, your father's primary tools, money, political connection, intimidation, become significantly less useful." "How quickly can you file?" Caleb said. "I'll have the emergency petition drafted tonight. If I have depositions from both of you and a signed statement from Mrs. Aldridge before 10 o'clock this evening, I can be at Crum's clerk's office when it opens tomorrow morning at 7. He looked at Penelope. "The deposition will take time. We need your full account from the beginning." "Then let's start," she said. The depositions took 4 hours. Haskell's stenographer was a young woman of perhaps 22 who kept her expression carefully neutral and whose pen moved continuously, never pausing, keeping up with everything Penelope said without apparent difficulty. Penelope described everything: the gala, Gerald Fitch, the carriage ride home, her father in her doorway, the wagon south, Caleb meeting her on the dark track, the contract she found, the letters, Mercer's first visit and his second, the shot through the window frame, the decision to come to Denver. She spoke in the measured, factual way that lawyers apparently preferred, and that was also, she found, the way she preferred to speak about these things now. Not because the emotion wasn't there, but because she had learned on the mountain that emotion was most effective when it was directed rather than scattered. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The stenographer's pen stopped. Haskell looked at his notes. "One more question," he said, "and I want you to think before you answer." "Go ahead." "What do you want from this?" He looked at her directly. "Not what you're entitled to, not what the law provides. What do you actually want?" She had expected legal strategy, not this. She sat with it for a moment. I want the land to stay with Caleb, she said. That's first. The mountain belongs to him, and nothing that has happened changes that. She looked at the documents on Haskell's desk. I want Colfax, the land office man, to answer for what he did, because he made this possible, and he'll make the next thing possible if nothing happens to him. She paused. And I want my father to know that I came back, that whatever he believed about me, that I was weak, that the mountain would solve him of me, that I was the kind of problem that could be sent away and erased. I want him to know he was wrong, completely wrong. She held Haskell's gaze. Whether he goes to prison or not is your business and the judge's. That part is mine. Haskell studied her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way men nod when they've understood something they hadn't quite expected. All right, he said, go get some rest. Be back here at 7 tomorrow morning. It was full dark by the time they left his office. Denver at night was gaslights and horse traffic and the distant sound of a piano from somewhere down the block, the ordinary texture of the city she had grown up in, and it now felt like a coat that belonged to someone else. She stood on the exterior staircase above the bootmaker's shop and breathed the city air, coal and horses and bakery sweetness from somewhere nearby, and felt the strangeness of being back inside the thing she'd been outside of for 4 months. Caleb came out behind her and stood at the top of the stairs. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The city moved below them, indifferent and continuous. Haskell's good, Caleb said. Better than I remembered. He asked the right questions. She looked down the street toward where the Harrington house sat 3 blocks south. Invisible in the dark, but present the way everything familiar is present, even when you can't see it. My father is in that house right now. Probably. Wondering what Mercer's silence means. She looked at the dark in that direction. Mercer would have sent word that something went wrong, but not what. So my father is sitting there in the not knowing, which is the thing he hates most. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, you've thought about him a lot. This winter. I've thought about everything this winter. You don't exactly provide a lot of distractions. He made a sound that was almost the laugh, the same one she'd heard on the morning her fire went out, quiet and genuine. It was still one of the better sounds she'd encountered. Penelope. He said her name with its weight. She turned. He was looking at her with that direct, present quality, and underneath it the thing that had been building for months and had never been said, and she looked back and waited. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said. Whatever the judge does or doesn't do. He stopped, started again. What you did. Coming back. Bringing the evidence. Making this case possible. That's yours. Not mine, not Haskell's. He said this with the firmness of a man stating a fact rather than offering comfort. You came up that track in November in wrong boots, carrying one bag, and 4 months later you're standing here about to take down a railroad empire. I just taught you which end of a rifle to hold. She looked at him. Her chest did the unnamed thing it had been doing with increasing frequency since somewhere around February. You sat down in the snow beside me on the 9th day of practice, she said. You didn't have to do that. You were frustrated. I know, you didn't have to sit in the snow. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said. I didn't. She held his gaze. The city kept going below them. Voices from a nearby saloon, a wagon on the cobblestones, that piano still playing its unresolved thing somewhere. And she stood at the top of that rickety staircase and felt the particular and frightening clarity of a person who has run out of reasons to pretend they don't know something. After tomorrow, she said. What do you want? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, I want to go home. Take care of Rex. Start the spring planting on the east slope. He paused. I'd like it if that wasn't something I did alone. She looked at him. The mountain is very cold. You know that already. And very far from everything. You know that too. She did. She knew the cold and the distance and the way the silence pressed in, and she knew the way the light came back in spring, and what it did to the south-facing slope, and how Rex sounded when he was dreaming by the stove, and the precise weight of a wolf coat around her shoulders. She knew all of that. All right, she said. After tomorrow. He nodded. One small, certain movement. They found the boarding house on Arapahoe Street that Haskell had recommended. Clean, warm, run by a Mrs. Fenton who asked nothing beyond what she needed for the register and brought food up without being asked. Penelope ate at the small table by the window and watched the city below, and thought about her father 3 blocks south, and about tomorrow, and about the specific way things look when you are finally on the right side of something and you know it and you are not afraid. She thought about the contract going up in the stove. She thought about the train north to Denver, where the woman who came back was wearing the boots of a woman who knew things the woman who left had not known. She thought about the journal in Mrs. Aldridge's strongbox, 11 years of someone else's quiet courage waiting for this. She set down the fork and looked out the window at the Denver night, at her father's city going about its ordinary business in the dark, not knowing yet what morning was going to bring. She was not sorry. She examined herself for it, the way she had learned to examine things on the mountain, directly, without flinching, without the small social adjustments that once made everything softer and less true. She found no sorry in her. She found something else instead. The solid, functional, undramatic feeling of being in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, which she had not felt very many times in her life, and which felt, she thought, like what it must feel like to be a fire that has finally found its proper draft. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming, clean and deep and complete, until the morning light came through the window, and it was time to go take her father apart. She was awake before the light came fully through the window, not the anxious waking of the old Penelope, the kind that arrived with a stomach full of dread and a mind already rehearsing every way a day could go wrong, but the clean, purposeful waking of someone who has a thing to do and has been ready to do it for longer than they realized. She dressed in the dark, ate what Mrs. Fenton had left on the tray outside her door, and was downstairs by 6:15, which was 45 minutes before she needed to be anywhere. Caleb was already in the small sitting room off the entry, his coat on, his coffee finished by the look of the empty cup on the side table. He looked at her when she came in, and she looked at him, and neither of them said good morning because good morning was not the register the day required. Haskell sent a note, Caleb said. He held out a folded paper. An hour ago. His boy delivered it. She took it and read it. Haskell's handwriting, small and precise. Filing accepted by Crumb's clerk at 6:40 this morning. Judge will hear preliminary arguments at 9. Bring everything. Come to the side entrance on Blake Street, not the front. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. He moved fast, she said. Said he would. She stood in the sitting room of the boarding house on Arapahoe Street and took a slow breath and felt the particular quality of the morning, the way it had weight to it, the way it was the kind of morning that would be a before and after in her life. And she was on the before side of it still, standing in the last few minutes of the version of things that hadn't happened yet. Are you ready? Caleb said. Yes, she said. And she was. Mrs. Aldridge met them outside Haskell's office at 7, as arranged, arriving 2 minutes early because she was constitutionally incapable of arriving any other way. She had dressed for the occasion, not formally, but deliberately, the way a person dresses when they have decided to be taken seriously. She looked at Penelope when she arrived, and something passed between them that was not quite an acknowledgement and not quite an apology, but contained elements of both, and then Haskell opened his door and they went up the stairs and got to work. The next 90 minutes were the most concentrated of Penelope's life. Haskell walked them through the morning's procedure with the thoroughness of a man who trusted preparation over hope. He explained Judge Crumb, who did not like surprises and did not like wasted time, but who was, in Haskell's considered opinion, genuinely incorruptible in a territory where that was unusual enough to be remarkable. He explained what a preliminary hearing meant, that they were not arguing the full case today. They were establishing sufficient cause for an investigation and a temporary injunction on the land claim, and critically, a freeze on Arthur Harrington's ability to transfer, sell, or encumber the mineral rights to the Montgomery property while the case was pending. If we get the injunction, Haskell said, your father's primary move is blocked. He can't sell the claim, can't transfer it, can't use it. Everything he did this for becomes temporarily inaccessible, and temporary in law has a way of becoming permanent when the underlying documents are what these are. And Colfax? Penelope asked. The land office man. Federal marshals are delivering a subpoena to his office as we speak. Whether he cooperates or attempts to run tells us something useful either way. He looked at her over his glasses. Your father does not yet know about this morning's filing. He will know by 9 o'clock because his name is on the documents and the clerk's office is not a sealed room. That gives us approximately 2 hours of lead time. Enough? It has to be, Haskell said. Not reassurance, just fact. She appreciated the distinction. The territorial courthouse on Larimer Street was a 3-story sandstone building that had been constructed to project permanence and largely succeeded. Penelope had been inside it once as a child, accompanying her father to some business she hadn't understood at the time, and understood now as the specific kind of business men conducted in rooms where decisions were made and records were kept. She came in through the Blake Street side entrance as instructed, Caleb beside her, Mrs. Aldridge and Haskell slightly ahead, and the building received them without ceremony, which was exactly right. Judge Elias Crumb's courtroom was on the 2nd floor. It was not large, this was a preliminary hearing, not a full proceeding, and when they arrived at 8:50 it was occupied by the judge's clerk arranging papers at the bench. 2 men Haskell identified quietly as federal marshals standing near the back wall, and a stenographer setting up her equipment with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen many mornings like this and treated them all the same. Penelope sat at the table to the left and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at the judge's empty bench and thought, this is the room. This is where it happens or doesn't happen. Everything that came before, the gala, the contract, the wagon track in the dark, the 9 days of rifle practice, the creek crossing, the depositions, the train, all of it led here, to this room, to this table, to these documents in this oilskin wrap she was now placing on the surface in front of her. Caleb sat beside her. His presence was the same as it had always been, not reassuring in the soft, performed way people performed reassurance, but simply real and solid and there. She had learned over 4 months that his being there was one of the more reliable facts of her current existence, and she relied on it without making a production of it, which was exactly how he would have wanted it relied on. At 9:05, the door at the side of the courtroom opened, and Judge Elias Crumb came in. He was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, compact, with white hair cut close, and a face that had the specific economy of expression of someone who had spent decades listening to people try to tell him what to think and had gotten very good at not being moved by the attempt. He sat, arranged 2 papers in front of him, and looked at Haskell. Mr. Haskell, he said. His voice was dry and direct. Your filing was unusual in several respects. I've read it twice. Proceed. Haskell was on his feet before the sentence finished. He was Penelope found a different kind of person when he was standing in a courtroom. Not larger exactly, but more concentrated, like something that had found the exact context it was designed for. He laid out the case in 22 minutes without notes, which she had not seen him do in preparation, and which impressed her considerably. He presented the letters first, moving through each one with precise reference to the relevant language. He presented Mrs. Aldridge's journal with an explanation of its provenance and the conditions under which it had been maintained. He presented the deposition transcripts, Penelope's, Caleb's, and the statement Mrs. Aldridge had signed the previous evening, and he laid them in front of the judge in the order that told the story most clearly. When he finished, Judge Crumb looked at the documents for a long moment. He picked up the first letter, the one in Arthur Harrington's personal handwriting, and read it again slowly to himself. Miss Harrington, he said without looking up. She stood. Your Honor. Now he looked up. He studied her with the same direct, undecorated attention she had come to associate with people who were genuinely trying to understand something rather than trying to manage it. This letter. In your father's hand. You recovered this from a courier's dropped case on the Montgomery property. Mr. Montgomery recovered it. From the snow, approximately 1 month before we left the mountain. And the contract referenced in your deposition, the one describing the disposition arrangement, you say Mr. Montgomery destroyed it. He burned it, in the stove, the night I found it. A pause. Why? She looked at the judge. He said I wasn't property. He said it was gone. She held the judge's gaze. I think he was also angry. He burned it the way you destroy something you don't want to exist in the world anymore. Crum held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at the papers. The witness journal from Mrs. Aldridge, 11 years of contemporaneous record. He set the letter down. Mr. Haskell, you're requesting an emergency injunction on the mineral rights claim and a freeze on asset transfer pending investigation. Correct, Your Honor. And a federal warrant for the examination of the Denver Land Office records pertaining to any Harrington-related filings in the past 5 years. Crum was quiet. The room was quiet. The stenographer's hands were still. One of the federal marshals near the back wall shifted his weight and the floor creaked and then was silent. The injunction is granted, Crum said. His voice hadn't changed. Same dry, direct register, no drama in it. The Land Office warrant is granted. I'm ordering federal marshals to accompany a letter to Mr. Arthur Harrington at his place of business informing him that he is the subject of a federal investigation and that all relevant documents are to be preserved. He looked at the clerk. Get Billings in here. We need the paperwork started before noon. He stood, looked at Penelope one more time. Miss Harrington, he said, you came a long way to be in this room. Yes, she said. I did. He nodded, once, with the economy of a man who had said what he meant and meant what he said. Then he went back through his door and the room exhaled around her. Haskell turned from the bench with an expression that was as close to satisfaction as she suspected he allowed himself in professional settings. The injunction is the critical piece, he said quietly, gathering his papers. Everything else follows from it. Your father cannot move the asset, cannot liquidate it, cannot use it as leverage. The investigation will take months, possibly a year, but the land is protected from this morning forward. She looked at him. Caleb's land. Caleb's land, Haskell confirmed. Registered, protected, and now the subject of a federal proceeding that makes any competing claim essentially inert. Caleb, beside her, said nothing. But she felt the shift in him. Something that had been held taut for a long time releasing slightly, the way a fence line goes when the pressure on it is finally removed. They knew the exact moment Arthur Harrington received the federal letter because the whole city seemed to know it within the hour. Denver was not, despite its ambitions, a large city, and what happened to powerful men in it traveled fast through the specific channels that powerful men had created for that purpose and that now worked equally well in the other direction. By noon, Penelope and Caleb were in Haskell's office drinking terrible coffee, and the first rumors were already arriving via Haskell's contact at the Rocky Mountain News. That marshals had been seen entering the Harrington Company offices on 17th Street, that Arthur Harrington had been in a closed-door meeting with his lawyers since 10 o'clock, that 2 of his 3 primary business partners had sent regrets to a luncheon he'd scheduled for that day. Business partners, she knew, were the first to read weather. The first to find somewhere else to be when a man's sky changed. Colfax, she said to Haskell. The land office man. Haskell set down his cup. His clerk told the marshal he took ill this morning and went home. The marshal found him at his house on Curtis Street with his bags half packed. He paused. He is currently in federal custody and has expressed considerable willingness to discuss the specifics of his arrangement with the Harrington Company. She looked at the wall. He'll give my father up. Men who pack their bags and get caught generally do. Haskell picked up his cup again. This is how these things work, Miss Harrington. The architecture your father built was strong when everyone inside it was protected by it. The moment the protection became uncertain, the structure starts to find its weaknesses. She thought about Mercer. What about Wyatt Mercer? A federal warrant is being prepared. He's known to operate out of Durango. Haskell looked at her steadily. He won't come near the mountain again. Whatever arrangements he had with your father are now liabilities rather than assets, and men like Mercer are very good at understanding which side of that line they're on. She nodded. She had thought she might feel something larger at this point. Triumph, vindication, the specific satisfaction of having been right about something important. What she actually felt was quieter and more complicated than that. Not disappointment, just reality, which is always smaller and stranger than the version of it you construct in advance. The afternoon came slowly. Haskell had more procedural work to do that didn't require them, so she and Caleb walked. Denver in March was gray and cold and beginning, just barely, to show the first signs of its intention to become something else. A few storefronts with their awnings down after winter, a cluster of new construction on a block she remembered as empty. She walked through it in her mountain boots and her trail-stained coat, and she did not care what she looked like to anyone she passed, which was not a feeling she had ever reliably had in this city before. They ended up at the edge of a small park near the Civic Center. Not a plan, just where the walking led. And they sat on a bench in the cold and watched pigeons do whatever pigeons do and didn't talk for a while. "He hasn't tried to contact you," Caleb said eventually. "No." She had thought about this. "He won't. Not today. He's with his lawyers and he's deciding what the situation is before he does anything because that's how he operates. He maps the terrain before he moves." She watched a pigeon navigate a conflict with another pigeon over a small piece of bread. The smaller one won, which she found obscurely satisfying. "He'll reach out eventually, through someone else first, probably, his lawyer to Haskell, testing what the appetite for settlement is. Is there one?" She looked at the bare trees across the park. "The injunction protects the land regardless of what else happens. That's done. Colfax cooperating means the bribery charge holds regardless of whether my father admits anything. The criminal conspiracy case, the part about the disposition agreement, that's where his lawyers will fight, and they might succeed because the language in the documents is careful." She paused. "He's very good at being careful in writing. But the investigation will be public. The filing is public. The Rocky Mountain News will have the story by tomorrow morning, and it will not be a story that his reputation survives intact, regardless of what a jury does or doesn't do eventually." She looked at her hands. He spent his entire adult life building that reputation, protecting it. That's what this was all about. Me, the land, the contract. I was a threat to the reputation, and the land was an asset, and he tried to solve both problems with one arrangement. She was quiet for a moment. "Losing the reputation will cost him more than losing the case." Caleb looked at her. "Is that enough for you?" She thought about it honestly, about the contract burning in the stove, about the look past her shoulder, about the 11 years Mrs. Aldridge spent writing things down in a locked journal because someone needed to know, even if no one ever read it. "I don't know," she said, which was true. "I think it has to be enough regardless of whether it feels like it, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life waiting for a thing I can't control." She turned to look at him. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life waiting." He looked back at her. "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." The message from Arthur Harrington came the next morning, as she had predicted. Not to her directly. To Haskell, from Harrington's primary attorney, a man named Farthwell, whom Haskell described as capable and expensive and not a man who made unnecessary moves. The message was a request for a meeting, not an admission, not an offer, just a meeting, the cautious first step of a man trying to understand the new shape of things. Haskell brought it to her at the boarding house over breakfast, read it to her from the note, and waited. "He wants to see me," she said. Farthwell's note says Mr. Harrington would welcome the opportunity to speak with his daughter privately before any further legal proceedings develop. She looked at the table, at her coffee, at the ordinary objects of the ordinary morning that was happening around a very specific decision. "What do you recommend?" Haskell was quiet for a moment. "I recommend that if you go with me present, that nothing said in that room is treated as binding without written documentation, and that you understand clearly that his objective in requesting the meeting is to assess whether you can be persuaded to moderate your position." He looked at her steadily. "I also think you probably already know whether you want to see him." She did know. She had known since the bench in the park the afternoon before, maybe since the train from Alamosa, maybe since the night on the cot when she had lain awake listening to the mountain and decided to come back instead of staying. "Set it up," she said. "Tomorrow morning, on neutral ground, not his offices." It was held in a private room at the Windsor Hotel, which was either an irony or just geography. The Windsor was where the Harrington Winter Gala had been held, where this had all started, where she had said the things to Gerald Fitch that her father had decided required her removal from the world. The private room was on the third floor, small and wood-paneled, with a window that looked out over the street and a table with 4 chairs where she sat with Haskell on her right, and Caleb, who had been welcomed into the meeting, or not, she'd told Haskell, or there was no meeting, on her left. Arthur Harrington came in with Farthwell, and without any of the authority, he usually wore the way other men wore hats. She noticed it immediately. Not that he looked broken, he didn't. He was too disciplined for that. But something had shifted in his carriage, some adjustment that you would only catch if you had spent 24 years reading the precise vocabulary of his physical composure. He sat down across from her and looked at her, and this time he did not look past her shoulder. For a long moment, nobody said anything. She had thought she would feel many things in this moment. She felt mostly very clear. "You look different," he said. "I am different," she said. He looked at his hands on the table. Arthur Harrington looking at his hands was so unusual an event that Farthwell beside him noticed it and recalibrated something in his own posture. "Farthwell tells me the federal case is substantial." "It is." "He tells me the land office man is cooperating." "He is." A pause. "I want you to know—" He stopped, started again, more carefully. "What was arranged, the specific terms?" He looked up. Something in his face was working at something it wasn't accustomed to working at, and the effort was visible in a way she had never seen on him before. "It was not my intention for you to—" "Don't," she said, quietly, not angrily, just final. "Please don't tell me what your intentions were. I have the letters. I've read them. I know what the language means." He closed his mouth. "What I want to know," she said, "is whether you understand what you did. Not legally. Not in terms of exposure or liability." She held his gaze. "Whether you understand that you signed a document that assigned a dollar value to whether your daughter lived or died, and that you did it because I embarrassed you at a party." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, Denver went about its business. Arthur Harrington looked at his daughter for a long moment, and for the first time in her memory, not all of it maybe, but as far back as she could reliably reach, he did not look past her shoulder. He looked at her face, at the woman sitting across from him in mountain boots with her spine straight and nothing left to prove to him, and something moved across his expression that she could not name with certainty and did not try to. "Yes," he said. One word, quiet. Not a confession. She knew what confessions looked like, and this wasn't quite that. It was something smaller and more real than a confession. It was a man who had just used the one syllable he had available and didn't have the rest. She sat with it for a moment. "All right," she said. "Then here is what happens now." She placed her hands flat on the table. The gesture she had made in Haskell's office. The gesture she seemed to make when she was stating terms. "The Montgomery land claim stands. The injunction stands. Your attempt to file a competing claim is over. If you attempt to contest this or interfere in any way with Caleb's ownership of that property, the full criminal referral, including the conspiracy charge, goes forward with our complete cooperation." She paused. "If you leave the land alone, the pace and scope of the criminal investigation is a matter for the federal prosecutor, not me. I have no control over that, but I won't accelerate it." Farthwell leaned over and said something very quietly to Harrington. Harrington listened without looking away from Penelope. "The company," he said, "the railroad contracts." "Not my concern," she said. "The investigation will go where it goes. What I'm telling you is what I personally will and won't do, and what I am personally requiring of you. The rest is between you and the federal government." Another quiet moment. Farthwell said something else. Harrington gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Agreed," he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Her father. The man who had not looked at her when he signed the paper, who had looked past her shoulder, who had built an empire and decided she was a liability to it. She looked at him and tried to find something in herself that wanted to say more, that wanted to reach across the table towards something, grief or connection, or any of the things that were supposed to exist between a parent and a child. She found something. It was small and tired and a long way from what it might have been in a different life. She didn't try to make it larger than it was. "I'm not coming back to Denver," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because you're sending me anywhere, because I choose not to." She stood. "Take care of yourself. I mean that in whatever way you can understand it." She picked up her coat. Caleb stood beside her and Haskell beside him, and they left the room and walked down the corridor and down the stairs and out through the Windsor Hotel's front doors into the March cold of the street, and she breathed the city air and looked up at the Denver sky, which was very blue above the buildings. "That's done," Caleb said. "Yes," she said, "that's done." They left Denver 2 days later, after Haskell had filed the final documents, and walked them through the remaining procedural requirements and shaken both their hands with the genuine warmth of a man who had seen something he was glad to have been part of. Mrs. Aldridge came to the station to see them off, came quietly, without announcement, and stood on the platform in her careful coat and looked at Penelope with the expression of someone who has set down a very heavy thing and is still adjusting to the new weight of her arms. "What will you do?" Penelope asked her. "I've given my notice," Mrs. Aldridge said. "I have a sister in Colorado Springs. I've been meaning to visit for 6 years. She paused. "I think I'll stay for a while." Penelope looked at her. "Thank you for the records, for the testimony, for—" She stopped, "for saying you were sorry and meaning it." Mrs. Aldridge pressed her lips together briefly. Then, "You came back from that mountain a different person." "I came back from that mountain myself," Penelope said. "That's the difference." The older woman nodded. Something in her eyes was bright and brisk and not quite steady. Then she stepped back, and the train did what trains do, and Denver began to fall away behind them for the second time, and this time Penelope did not look back. The route home was different from the route they'd taken south, not the back trail through the canyon, but the main Durango road, which was passable now that March had committed to itself. They rode from Alamosa with horses purchased in the city, which were adequate if not excellent, and the journey took 2.5 days of weather that was mixed and cold and occasionally beautiful in the impersonal way of mountain country in early spring. On the second afternoon, high on a ridge looking north toward where the cabin would be if you could see that far, Caleb stopped his horse and she stopped hers beside him, and they looked at the country in front of them for a while. "Rex," she said, "Clem will have looked after him." "I know." She looked at the mountains, at the specific shapes of them that she had learned over winter and could now read the way you read faces. Not just seeing them, but knowing them. "I keep thinking about something Haskell said, about the architecture being strong when everyone inside it is protected." She looked at Caleb. "My father spent his life building things that required other people to stay in their assigned places to hold up. The moment one person stepped out of place," she gestured, a small movement, "the whole thing found its weakness." Caleb looked at the country. "Some structures are built on compliance," he said. "Mountain doesn't care what you built it on." She thought about that. About the cabin that had stood 9 winters because it was built for the actual conditions of the place, not the conditions someone wished the place had. About the difference between a thing built to appear strong and a thing built to be strong. About a man who had signed a paper and looked past his daughter's shoulder and built his empire on the assumption that the people he discarded would stay discarded. She had not stayed discarded. That was the whole of it, really. Every complicated thing that had happened over the past 4 months resolved, if you pulled it back far enough, to that single fact. She had not stayed where she was put. She had refused, not dramatically, not with any plan, just stubbornly and persistently, and with the particular tenacity of a person who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to be afraid of. She thought, this is the thing nobody tells you about hitting bottom. They tell you it's where you push off from. They don't tell you that the pushing off doesn't look like strength at first. It looks like just not sinking further. It looks like eating cold cornbread standing up because there's no time to sit. It looks like walking a dark track in wrong boots because the only other option is standing still in the dark, and standing still in the dark was never going to be enough. "Let's go home," she said. They came down off the ridge and rode north. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it, which should not have surprised her, but did slightly, because she had half expected the world to have rearranged itself in the weeks they'd been gone. It hadn't. The woodpile was lower than it should have been. Clem had used some, she supposed, when he came to check on Rex. And the south-facing slope showed the first pale suggestion of green coming through the dead grass, which was not there when they left. Otherwise, the same square permanence of it, the same smoke-dark chimney, the same way the pine trees stood around it like they'd decided this was a reasonable thing to stand around. Rex was on the porch. He was lying in the weak afternoon sun, his gray muzzle on his paws, and he lifted his head when they came into the clearing, looked at Caleb, looked at Penelope. Then he got up, slowly, with the considered dignity of a very old dog who was not going to rush regardless of the circumstances, and came down the porch steps to meet them. Caleb crouched down and put both hands on the dog's head and said nothing. Rex leaned into it. Penelope stood beside them both and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was still tight. "Hey," she said to the dog quietly. "We're back." Rex looked at her with his amber eyes and then leaned against her knee, which was, she had learned, the highest available expression of approval in his vocabulary. The first weeks back on the mountain were a specific kind of ordinary that she had not known to want, but found she did. The work of the place reasserting itself, the spring trap line to check, the roof to inspect after winter's wait, the east slope Caleb had mentioned where he planned to start something, she still wasn't sure quite what, and she was going to find out by being there for it rather than being told about it. The days were longer now, the light coming back with the particular quality she had first noticed in February, and the mountain was doing what mountains did in spring, not transforming exactly, more like remembering itself. She wrote to Haskell once a week. He wrote back with updates that were, over the course of the following months, consistently in the direction of resolution, the investigation proceeding, Colfax cooperation proving more extensive than expected, Farthwell negotiating a settlement that stopped well short of criminal trial, but involved significant financial penalties, and the public dissolution of the land claim scheme. The Rocky Mountain News running 4 consecutive stories that treated Arthur Harrington's reputation with the thoroughness of a controlled demolition. She read Haskell's letters at the table in the evenings, with Caleb across from her and Rex at their feet, and she read the relevant parts aloud, and they discussed them briefly and practically, and then went back to whatever they had been doing before the letter, which was usually reading or talking about what they'd noticed that day on the mountain, which was also a kind of reading. She thought about her father sometimes. Not constantly, not with the consuming frequency she had once thought about him, the way you think about something when you're still inside it. But occasionally, in the particular way you think about something you have put down and walked away from, not without effort, but finally. She did not know in the end whether Arthur Harrington understood what he had done in any way that would change him. She suspected he understood the consequences with considerable precision and the act itself with somewhat less. Men like him usually did. The architecture of their self-understanding was as carefully constructed as everything else they built, and as resistant to examination. She had decided, somewhere between Denver and the ride home, that she could not make him understand. She could only do what she had done, which was to refuse to be solved by his arrangements, and to build something true on the ground he had tried to take from under her. The rest was his to carry, and it was heavy enough that she didn't need to add her own weight to it. Caleb proposed on a Tuesday in May, which she found characteristic. Not a significant date, not a planned moment. They were checking the east slope fence line, which had come down in one section over the winter, and he was mid-repair, and she was holding the wire. And he said, without preamble, "I think we should get married." She held the wire and looked at the side of his head. "You think we should," she said. "I think it makes sense." He pulled the wire taut and checked the tension. "And I think I would like it." Those are usually both supposed to be true at the same time. She felt the thing in her chest. Not the unnamed thing anymore. It had a name now. She had given it one somewhere around March, privately, in the way she handled things she was still deciding what to do with. You could have asked this somewhere more romantic than a fence line. You don't care about romantic. That's not entirely true. He looked at her then, set down the wire tool, looked at her with that straight, present look that she had learned over months was the most honest thing she had ever been given, the look of a person who was actually seeing her, not the shape of her, or the category of her, or the use of her, but her. "Penelope," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him. This man, this scarred and quiet and deeply particular man who had sat in the snow beside her on the 9th day and given her his coat in the dark, and burned a contract because she was not property, and taught her to build fires and shoot rifles and listen to mountains, and who had said, standing on a staircase in Denver, that he would like her there on the east slope in the spring. "Yes," she said. Obviously, yes. He almost smiled. She had gotten very good at seeing the almost smiles. Obviously, he said. Don't push it, she said. They were married in June by the circuit judge who came through Durango on his quarterly route, in the presence of Clem, Ada from the trading post, Dario, who arrived 2 days early and brought a bottle of something that turned out to be exceptionally good, and Haskell, who made the trip from Denver and arrived looking like a man who had not been on a horse in several years and was not going to admit it. It was not a formal occasion. It was outdoors, on the east slope where the fence line had been repaired and the new planting was coming up in uneven rows that would probably be more even next year, and the mountain stood around them being the mountain, which was the only thing it had ever agreed to do, and which was more than sufficient. Rex attended. He lay in the sun near the proceedings with his paws crossed and his eyes open, and she thought he looked satisfied, which was probably her projecting onto an old dog, but which she permitted herself anyway because some things you are allowed to project. She had no flowers. She wore her best dress, which was not the emerald silk that was in Denver, in a house she didn't live in anymore, but a dark blue wool she'd had made in Durango in April. Good quality, nothing decorative, exactly the right thing for a woman who lived on a mountain and knew it. She stood beside Caleb on the east slope in her blue wool and her mountain boots, and she listened to the circuit judge say the necessary words, and she said the ones she was supposed to say and felt the specific and undecorated realness of the moment, which was better than anything performed could have been. What she thought, standing there, was not romantic in the way that word usually gets used. She thought, I was sent here to disappear. I was sent to a mountain in the winter with one bag and wrong boots to be solved, to be made convenient by becoming absent. And instead I learned to build fires and shoot rifles and read snow and stay. Instead, I found a man who saw what I was and didn't ask me to be anything else. Instead, I came back to the city that threw me away and stood in a federal courtroom with my hands on a table, and I said, this is what happened, and this is what you will do about it, and I did not shake. She thought, the same things my father tried to use against me. The stubbornness, the refusal to be managed, the way I couldn't make myself smaller than I was. Those were the exact things that kept me alive on this mountain. The exact things. What he called a problem was what saved me. What he tried to punish me for was what I needed most. There is something important in that, she thought, something that takes a long time to understand and longer to believe, but which is true whether you believe it or not. The qualities that make you inconvenient to other people's arrangements are very often the qualities most native to your own survival. A woman who can be made small enough to disappear was always going to disappear. A woman who cannot be made that small, who resists, who argues, who refuses to be the right shape for somebody else's convenience. That woman is a problem until she is standing on a mountain in May learning to build fires. Then she is exactly what the situation requires. You do not have to be grateful for the hard thing. You do not have to thank the person who tried to break you. But if you are standing somewhere true at the end of it, somewhere you built with your own hands and your own stubbornness and the help of people who saw you clearly, then the hard thing was part of the route, even if it wasn't the route you would have chosen. Penelope would not have chosen this. She would not have chosen the gala or the contract or the dark track in November or the months of learning everything from the beginning in weather that had no interest in her comfort. She would not have chosen any of it. She would choose where she stood now, every time, without hesitation. She would choose the east slope and the blue wool dress and the circuit judge saying the necessary words, and Caleb beside her and Rex in the sun and the mountain doing the only thing it had ever agreed to do, which was stand there being itself, permanent and indifferent and more beautiful than anything she had ever been offered in exchange for being smaller. The judge finished. Caleb looked at her. She looked at him. Rex got up from the sun and walked over and leaned against both their legs simultaneously, which required some adjustment of position from both of them, which made Dario laugh from somewhere behind them, which made Clem make a sound that was as close to a laugh as Clem produced. Well, Haskell said from his seat on a tree stump, looking both moved and like he would prefer not to be caught looking moved. Congratulations. Thank you for coming all this way, Penelope said. It was considerably better than I expected, he said, which from Haskell was the equivalent of a speech. Later, after the food was gone and Dario's excellent bottle was gone, and Clem had headed back down the mountain and Haskell was asleep in the spare room that had been the supply room until she'd reorganized it in March, she and Caleb sat on the porch in the dark, the way they had sat on many evenings over many months. And the mountain was around them, and the stars were the extraordinary quantity she had first seen on the night she arrived, packed into the black sky like something spilled. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. Rex was between their feet, breathing his slow, deep breath. "Are you happy?" she said. She asked it simply, the way she asked things now, without the old anxiety about the answer, without needing it to be one thing or another. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone avoiding the question, the silence of someone answering it honestly. "Yes," he said, "more than I thought I was going to be, at any point." She thought about that, about the word any, about the 9 years he had spent on this mountain alone, building the careful life of a man who had tried other things and found they didn't fit. About the night he'd walked out of the trees and given her his coat, which he had said was practical, and which she knew now was also the first gesture of a person who had decided, in some quiet and preliminary way, that she was worth a practical gesture. "Me too," she said, "more than I thought." The night was cold and clear and very still. The mountain stood around them doing what it always did. Below, somewhere, Denver was still being Denver. The money and the politics and the architecture of power, rearranging itself around the space Arthur Harrington's empire had occupied, other men moving into the gaps the way men always moved into gaps. The world was what the world was. Up here, on the east slope, things were simpler and truer and harder in the specific way that things are hard when they are real. She had been sent here to disappear. She had done the opposite of that. She had become, on this mountain, in this cold, through this particular and unlikely sequence of events, the most present she had ever been in her life. Not the most comfortable, not the most admired. Not the version of herself that her father's world would have recognized or wanted, but real, in the way that only specific and difficult and chosen things are real. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, she thought, leaning against Caleb in the dark, with Rex's warm weight on their feet and the stars doing their extraordinary work overhead, exactly everything.